Hello, everyone, and welcome to Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted by Barber Library. My name is Michelle Spomer. I'm the library director. Our author today is Dr. Rafael, right? Yeah. Rafael. We've got a bunch of Rafaels and Rafaels here. So our author today is Dr. Rafael Rodríguez. He will be having a conversation with Dr. Scott Hagley about his book, The First Christian Letters, reading 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, published by Cascade Books. Dr. Rafael Rodríguez, who joined the PTS faculty this year, is one of our New Testament professors and has taught for nearly 20 years. He earned his MA in Biblical Studies at Cincinnati Christian University and his PhD in Biblical Studies at the University of Sheffield in England. Dr. Rodríguez's areas of expertise include the Apostle Paul, the Epistle to the Romans, the Epistles to the Thessalonians, Paul within Judaism, and Second Temple Judaism and Christian origins. He also specializes in social memory approaches to the Bible. In addition to the First Christian Letters, he is the author of several other books and many journal articles, which you will probably find in our online guide. He currently serves on the Catholic Biblical Quarterly Editorial Board, the Life, Letters, and Legacy of Paul Steering Committee, and the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus Editorial Board. Dr. Scott Hagley, who is Dr. Rodríguez's conversation partner tonight, joined the Pittsburgh Seminary faculty in 2015 and currently serves as the W. Don McClure Associate Professor of World Mission and Evangelism. Formerly, he served as a Director of Education at Forge Canada in Surrey, British Columbia, where he worked to develop curriculum for the formation of missional leaders in hubs across Canada. Dr. Hagley received an MDiv from Regent College and a PhD with distinction in congregational mission and leadership from Luther Seminary. Very distinguished.
Thank you.
All right, so before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping matters to cover. First, we will be giving you lots of links. The first two will be places where you can purchase Dr. Rodríguez's book. So it'll be a bookshop.org link as well as an Amazon link. And of course, those of you who are local can come to Barber Library and check out the book. And library accounts are available to anyone who is local for a small annual fee. Also, we will provide a link to an online guide developed for this book talk, which includes books, journals, and websites that will help you explore this and related topics. This excellent guide was created by our user services librarian, Tisha, who's in the back there, taking pictures. There is also a curated display of books right around the corner, actually, that in-person attendees can peruse after the book talk, as well as a bibliography and a printout of links on the sculpture back there. For those of you online, this bibliography is available through the online subject guide. And for those of you interested in more information about our two conversation partners, their faculty page links are also on that page. Please be aware that this book talk will be recorded and then posted in a couple of places. For our Zoom attendees, we will provide links for these at the end of the book talk. You may want to also view the live transcription during the book talk, which you can see by clicking the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions that you would like to ask, we invite you to do this throughout the conversation by clicking on the Q&A button, also at the bottom of your screen, and then entering your question. And for our in-person attendees, there will be about a 10-minute or more Q&A session at the end, so get your questions ready. Lastly, I'd like to thank our communication staff, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, who help us with advertising and registration. I'd also like to thank the fabulous Bobby Jarsulik for being our fabulous as I've already said, BookTALK tech support person. And finally, thanks to Tisha Wu, especially for creating wonderful educational resources as well as setting this up. And now, after all of that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Hagley and Dr. Rodríguez.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Welcome. It's good to have all of you here. Dr. Rodríguez, great to have this conversation. I just, first of all, want to congratulate you on an excellent book. It was fun to read. I was telling you earlier today, I get emails from family members all over the place. They're like, hey, you do this theology thing. I'm in a Bible study about X. I'm looking at this YouTuber. What do you think? And it's almost always a terrible YouTuber, terrible idea. And I never quite have the right resources. This would be the kind of resource that would be great to hand off. It's super readable. It's engaging. It's attentive to the text, and anyway, so it's really excellent.
Thank you.
It was great to read. So my first question would just be to describe a little bit about the genesis of this book. Why this book? Why now? What sort of led to this particular project?
Yeah, thank you. This book is kind of an act of penance for me. I had been studying Paul, and particularly the letter to the Romans, for a little over half a decade. Have a couple of publications under my belt, and had really enjoyed joining the international discussion on Paul and his writings. And then in teaching undergraduate students and orientation of the New Testament class, we got to the Thessalonian letters, and I thought this will be easy. I know plenty about Paul, and I really struggled to teach these short little letters and was just a bit overwhelmed by how little I knew about them. And now some of that comes from, I have a bit of an innate distaste, maybe I shouldn't confess this, but an innate distaste for eschatology.
Good, I have a question about that later. So,
especially because of the popularity of YouTubers with views on eschatology, and I think that's why I had avoided the Thessalonian letters. But I had a sense that they were probably important, and so I decided I wanted to learn about them. And so I engaged a study, worked on a translation, started reading, started learning about these letters, and really found them interesting, and decided I wanted to produce a kind of an introduction to the letters themselves, but also an introduction to Paul, to invite people who are doing the hoary, hairy work of being Christians in our world today, and who find these texts in some way normative or prescriptive for what it means to be that kind of person. So I'm exactly reaching for an audience like what you described, people who are just looking for a way to study Scripture that might inform some way their own efforts at being followers of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. How do you hope people use the text? Like there's discussion questions in the back of each chapter. What, as you imagine your audience, what is your hope for what this sort of does in the world?
Yeah, I do kind of hope that the book is more suggestive than it is settling all the questions. I mean, if you walk away from this book thinking, I know everything about the Thessalonian letters or Paul or Christianity today, I'd be surprised at what you found in the book and stuff. But I do hope it's suggestive for how do we wrestle with these twin poles of the Thessalonian letters, which are probably the oldest or the first Christian texts, the oldest extant letters we have written by Christians. So we have nothing older than that. And also the challenge of living a faithful Christian life today, which is as far removed from the resurrection as we've ever been. And we just keep getting further and further. And how do we live in that ever-widening gap between an old, you might think, outdated and irrelevant text that in some way is for us the Word of God, and this crazy world where we try to bring the shalom and the peace and the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm hoping that this book is suggestive for ways of bridging that gap for people.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that leads me well into the next question. So what would be one of your kind of big takeaways after this project? So when faced with that question, what do 1st and 2nd Thessalonians tell us about what it means to be Christians in this time, in this moment? What's your elevator speech?
Yeah, my elevator speech. When we talked earlier today, one really great elevator speech came into my head, and now it's gone.
It was good. It was really good. You all missed out.
But if I had to make up a new answer on the spot, what I think is most fascinating, not just about these letters, but all of Paul's letters, and maybe these letters are just, because these are among the shortest and most accessible of Paul's letters, this is just one of the easiest places to enter into this, is that Paul is very much his own person. He's not you, he's not me. He's not a modern Western Christian. He never uses this label to describe himself, Christian. He uses words that we would never use to describe ourselves. He uses those words to describe himself. He is a native-born Jew. He is an Israelite. He is of the tribe of Benjamin. He is these things that we are not. And yet he feels himself called. He insists he is called by God to reach out to people who are not at all like him. He is the apostle to the Gentiles. So while he may be a native-born Jew, he may be an Israelite, he may be of the tribe of Benjamin, he is called to reach out to people who are nothing like that. And so Paul's life really is a life of reaching across boundaries to create community. And as you asked me, I mean, you didn't use this word, but your question made me think, what's my hermeneutic for reading Paul? What's my way of reading? What's the thing that I'm most looking for? It is that, how does Paul help me develop community, not just with the people who are like me, my family, or the people in my church, or the people in my neighborhood, but even with people who are not at all like me? How can we, in our humanity, in our shared image of Godness, find connection and belonging together? And I think that would be the elevator pitch.
Yeah. One of the things I appreciated about this book in particular is you're really doing a sort of theological reflection on Paul and on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and not simply an exegetical, and nothing against exegesis, but not simply sort of an exegetical development of like, this is what this text meant in this time. You're kind of moving back and forth between the text and current kind of questions that we have, and then what we know about Paul through Romans and Acts and other biblical texts, and helping us sort of see the implications of the questions that are being raised in this letter in sort of real time. And in one area in particular, there's a kind of ethical theme that runs all the way through, where you're reading Paul not so much as here's Paul's theology and then here's Paul's ethics, but Paul's theology and Paul's ethics kind of come as this kind of collective whole, right? And so on page 68, one of the places you sort of land, we talked about this.
Yeah.
I don't know what face you just made, but this isn't a gotcha.
Oh, no, I wrote page 68.
Yeah. You were there, and you typed it into the computer. Yeah. So you say two recurring words in Paul's ethical instructions that appear in 1 Thessalonians 5:12-21, as well as in Paul's later letters, are love and the good. And these two concepts are the lenses through which Paul's ethical vision passes. And those really are threads that you sort of pull all the way through the book. So I'm just wondering if you can reflect on love and the good. What's at stake theologically in that? What's at stake kind of practically in that?
Yeah, in some ways it really helps me to have these two. I mean, I wish we only had one. It would be even easier. But to have these two handles to grab onto when wrestling with the question, how would Paul want us to live in the world? What suggestions would he have for us as we're trying to live in the world? And these two words for me provide that handle: the good and loved. So he says in some pretty famous passages like Romans 12:9, let love be sincere, or not hypocritical. Or later in the same chapter, he says, do not be overcome by evil, instead overcome evil by means of the good. And so these concepts come together, and as you pointed out, we see them also in 1 Thessalonians 5. But what's difficult is they're rather undefined. They're rather ambiguous. What is love? What is the good? How do I know love when I see it? Sorry, I just got distracted by the 1980s hairband Whitesnake. Is this love that I'm feeling? Nobody gets that joke.
Anyway, or what is love?
Yeah. Anyway.
Well, SNL, yeah.
So, what are these things? And I do think there's, I do think I would bring a bit of critique to a lot of the church that I've had experience with that has sought to define these terms by saying, here are, we've scoured the texts, and here are the do's, and here are the don'ts, and if you do the do's and you don't do the don'ts, then that is the good, that is love, you've done it, well done. And I wonder if we might take that. I have the image of a telescope in my head. If we might take that telescope and flip it around and look at it from the other end, which is if we begin with love, if we begin with the good, and whatever situation we find ourselves in, we say, how does love respond in this moment? Or what does it mean to pursue the good here in this situation? Then the actions that flow out of that, the things that you do or don't do, are embodiments of the good or love. Now, in Paul's day, these were questions that are kind of irrelevant to us today. I mean, when was the last time you wrestled with, should I eat this steak that might have been offered to a god? It's not a common ethical dilemma in the 21st century church, but it was a raging issue in Paul's day. And so his answer wasn't to, well, let's look back and see what kinds of foods our sacred text told us we were allowed to eat. It was instead prioritizing the relationships in the community that could form or that could be disrupted by certain ethical choices. And I just wonder, what does it look like for us as, again, followers of we're not followers of Paul, we're followers of Jesus, but we're imitating Paul in our following of Jesus. What does it look like for us to follow Paul's example in following Jesus, in pursuing this well-being of others, no matter what they bring to me? They bless me, good, I bless them right back. They curse me, they persecute me, well, I don't curse or persecute right back. I pursue the love or the good in that situation as well. My response may be different. I may do a different thing, but my aim is the same. And Paul has some pretty striking things to say about this in some other letters, like the one who loves has fulfilled the law. And like for Paul, this is what it means to keep Torah, is to be loving of one's neighbor. And so I think it's vital for us to really reconnect with that question, what does it mean to love our neighbor? And I think there's room for us to critique ourselves from that angle and say, we've not always done a great job of loving our neighbor. I think that's not a controversial conclusion about the church today.
Mm-hmm. If I can just extend this on this topic, Paul reflects in 1 Thessalonians on his own sort of pastoral ministry among the church there, but also in all of his letters, he kind of reflects on his presence and his ministry to the people he's writing to. And I'm wondering, this notion of the good and love as the sort of bifocal, way of thinking of ethics. How does that shaped? How does that expressed in Paul's pastoral ministry? Is this a fair question?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking particularly about like in chapter 2, we were talking about this earlier today, Paul using maternal language to talk about his own care for the Thessalonians, but also times where Paul is a little bit more direct about knock it off, you're hurting yourself. And so I'm just, how does Paul how do those two things get reflected in Paul's pastoral ministry?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I think is makes Paul so interesting. Is he's not a paragon of always making the right choice. He is, in a lot of ways, he's just like us. He's got emotional responses to things. I'm not aware of any time that Paul in his extant letters apologized for a time he might have been wrong. But I like how, in his anger, he can say things like, "You foolish Galatians, who's bewitched you?" We're used to saying that, but he is shaming his readers. Like, what's wrong with you people? He can say some pretty emotionally direct things. I wish that those who are troubling you would emasculate themselves. Again, very, very direct things. And then he can surprise us on the other end, and he can say things like, some preach Christ out of envy and strife, and others do so out of love. And who cares? All that matters to me is that Christ is preached. But if there's a through line that connects those very different reactions that Paul might have in different situations, if there's a through line, I think it's that Paul was fanatically protective of his gospel that said, God is calling the nations to worship him, and he's calling them as they are. He's not calling them to be transformed, to become something that they're not, and then as a result of that transformation to see that they're worthy to join in worship. He's calling them as they are. And so this would be the source of his anger and frustration in some of his letters, or sadness and disappointment in others, and also joy when he finds that people are committed and remaining faithful to this call. Is that you're a Thessalonian, not a Jew? God is calling you to worship. The God of Israel is calling you to worship. He's not there. There aren't hoops or gates that you have to jump through. He's calling you as you are. You're one of these foolish Galatians. What makes you foolish is thinking that you have to change before your seat at the table is pulled out for you. No, you are welcome as you are. And so what we see in Paul's pastoral ministry is trying to convey, and sometimes effectively and sometimes maybe less effectively, but trying to convey that sense of invitation to all the nations. And again, I want to try and recover what I think is an oddness and a scandal to that call, because I hear the word Gentile, and I think, Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. He was summoning, inviting the Gentiles. Who cares? Gentiles. He's calling people who. Have you ever met somebody and you had a physical response to them, like maybe a fear response, maybe a disgust response, maybe you just don't want to be around that person anymore? I think Paul felt himself called to people he didn't want to be called to, and yet took seriously his obligation to reach out precisely to them. He's not attracted to pagans or paganism. He's not attracted to worshipers of idols and people who are even entertaining the thought of eating meat sacrificed to other gods. And yet God has called him and said, no, I want you to go tell them they're invited to my table. And so this is what he's about. And it's hard work and it's difficult work, and you're going to do things wrong. It would be interesting if Paul ever apologized for some of his missteps, but at
early church was just like, let's toss this aside.
Yeah, remove that.
We don't want these.
Yeah. But even if we don't see that in him, I as a student of Paul, I think I'm learning to at least extend that kind of grace to myself. If I'm truly called to people that it's hard to reach out to, it's okay when I don't do as well as I would like. Tomorrow I'll do better. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but
yeah, I mean that raises for me the question of hospitality, which is another theme that you have running through your book, and you have a chapter on it. As you were talking, I thought about this quote you have on page 119, where you say,
hold on, let me find it. Hold on.
I mean, you wrote it.
Wait, right. I got it.
Okay.
I got it.
Hospitality is transgressive. It violates the line between in and out. It treats outsiders as if they were insiders. this makes hospitality enormously difficult, even dangerous. I'm wondering if you could just expound a little bit more on that. What is, as we're thinking about Paul's ministry, Paul's pastoral approach, Paul's calling to build community with those that were not like him, and hospitality as this practice that sort of mediates that. And you make a case that how Paul talks about hospitality is very different from some of the hospitalities available to us, some of the ways we typically think of hospitality. So I'm just wondering if you can kind of parse that out a little bit, and particularly what's transgressive about what Paul's doing.
Yeah, I was talking to some students, to some of our students here about this a couple weeks ago. There's a sense of hospitality, or a related word, hosting, that doesn't require too much of me. I mean, when my parents come to visit us from out of town, they are of course welcome in my house. They're welcome at my table. We put our food in front of them. We let them sleep in our guest bed. My in-laws, well, maybe not my in-laws, but no, that's not. My in-laws are welcome if you're listening. We'd love to show you our new house. There are people who don't cost me much, and of course they're welcome. And there are places in the New Testament where we see this model of hospitality encouraged for the community, that the church should be welcoming for the church, that we shouldn't be divided from one another, that we shouldn't strive with one another, but that we should be warm towards one another. But Paul has this undertone that's more prominent in some of his later and longer letters, where hospitality is meant not to govern behavior within a boundary, but to extend behavior beyond the boundary. And that's what I mean when I say hospitality is transgressive, that it crosses the boundaries. And that sounds good, I think, for a lot of us, because boundaries, we live in a cultural environment where boundaries are getting a bit of a bad rap, and I buy into this, that boundaries that are meant to divide insiders from outsiders and police the traffic between the two, those are bad things. This is the way a lot of us think. But because we think that way, we're often blind to how useful and how important boundaries can be. We set up boundaries between, say, adult-oriented businesses and elementary schools. There ought to be boundaries that protect children from things that children should not be exposed to. Or we expect certain kinds of people to not be in most of our churches, and I mean that can be theologically problematic. But think about dangerous people. Think about pedophiles or abusive people. We don't want them in our churches because we want to protect the people within the church. Boundaries serve these functions. I'm uncomfortable saying this, but there's a sense in which I live my life as if, no matter what my words say, I live my life as if boundaries are good, and I have to acknowledge that. And so when Paul encourages a hospitality that transgresses boundaries, I need to wrestle with that. I need to say, this not only sounds important, it sounds hard. It sounds difficult, because boundaries can protect me. Why would Paul want us to lay aside boundaries if they protect? Certainly he doesn't want harm to come to us, does he? And as I think about the gospel, and as I read about what Paul says about welcoming the strangers, even the ones who are dangerous to you, even the ones who are persecuting or cursing or reviling you, even our enemies and whatnot, Paul seems to be operating from a faith that says, yeah, but if you really believe that God can take care of, protect, and provide for you and your people, then you don't need your boundaries. You can trust God. And I think there's a sense in which, and I might be a minority voice in this, but I think there's a sense in which Paul has a glimpse of faith in God as providing a safety that he can not rely that he cannot turn to boundaries to provide. I didn't say that well. Does that make sense? He can trust God to provide a safety that isn't provided by boundaries, and so he can ignore those boundaries and be open to others. And I find that immensely challenging. There are people that it's not hard for me to think I want to be more welcoming to them. But if I'm honest, there are also people that it would be very hard for me to be open and welcoming to. I won't give examples in case Ken is in the room. But I'm sorry, that was not fair. There are people that would be hard to be welcoming to. And I think the gospel calls me, I think Paul calls us to be open and welcoming and nurturing to them as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, so my follow-up would just be, so what is it about Ken? So you interact with the work of Richard Beck in his book, Unclean. Yeah. And I'm wondering if you could, for those that are not familiar with the book, maybe elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think Beck gets at some of the sort of theological, like, it helps us kind of name what I think Paul is doing theologically in this practice of hospitality.
Yeah, Beck has this great, he draws a link between biological and social processes. That sounds complicated, but you'll understand what I mean right away. If you've ever eaten something that's not good, maybe you've had some milk that's a little bit older than it should be, or some eggs that have gone slightly off, and you ingest it, you put it into your body, and then right away your stomach starts to feel a bit sour, and what your body physically does is it invokes an expulsive reaction. You vomit, right? You're removing it from your body. You know what I'm saying, right? Right?
Can we get a demonstration, maybe?
Somebody bring me the goat cheese. And then Beck says, and we do the same thing socially. That there are certain peoples, there are certain behaviors that when they come into our group, we socially react to them and then exert expulsive pressure on them. And so what Beck is trying to do, and he does this in some really interesting and helpful ways, and in some problematic ways. But what Beck is trying to do is show us that that Jesus comes and reverses that process. That rather than being repelled by the things that are revolting and that we naturally want to expel, he reaches out and embraces those things and touches them, and in so doing, transforms them. So he touches the leper who, and instead of being made unclean, his cleanness, his purity transfers to the leper. And I would describe that saying this is offensive purity, not defensive, but offensive purity. But I think I even like the word not just offensive, but offensive, because there is something offending about that. There is something that makes me go, why would Jesus be open to that? And not like, I want to be careful. I'm not suggesting all the other Jews in the room look at Jesus and go, why would he do that? I want to suggest all the other humans in the room. I would have the same reaction. But go, why is Jesus open to contact with this person that I find disgusting, revolting, off-putting? And I want to respond to that challenge of, maybe the problem's not that person, maybe the problem is my perception, my reaction to that person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like the kind of community Paul imagines Jesus creating among us is the transgressive moment of hospitality. The transgression of hospitality is about a continuing of that kind of logic. So in Romans 12, you do a lot with Romans 12 on treating even our enemies with grace and compassion, and in so doing, pouring burning coals upon their head.
Yeah. I mean, he's got this great. I mean, these are just three little words. This is not me. This is Paul. But he's got these three little words that are unnecessary in the text. Paul says, I'm reading from 1 Thessalonians 5. He says, "See to it that no one repays another person evil for evil, but always pursue the good." There's that, the good that you were mentioning before. But always pursue the good, both for one another and for everyone. And it's those three little words at the end that he didn't have to write that, and for everyone. He could have just said, always pursue the good for one another, and we would have said, yeah, that's exactly what we should do. We should be more good pursuing amongst ourselves. But those three little words, and for everyone, challenges me to lift my gaze beyond the people that I'm comfortable with on this side of my boundary and say, how do I pursue the good for the people on the other side of the boundary? Now, that doesn't always mean embrace. Sometimes people are on the other side of the boundary because they are dangerous. And I do have responsibilities for, say, protecting my children or my community, the well-being of the Bible would say widows, orphans, and aliens. But my response to them doesn't have to be protective. There has to be a sense of, I don't want to say there have to be. I want to say the gospel calls me to embrace a transgressive movement beyond the boundary. Mm-hmm. That and for everyone, it haunts me. It's what I take from these letters more than anything else. And for everyone, I don't know what to do with it. I mean, it's one thing to understand it. It's one thing to think, but I don't know how to live it. And that's what I think these letters challenge us as readers to do, is not just understand them, but to live that. And for everyone. Can you say you've done that? Can I say I've done that? I can't yet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To me, that leads into, I think, the last theme I wanted to draw attention to, and then we'll open up for questions, is you do engage the eschatological texts here that have been interpreted in a wide variety of ways. And so, so my question would be on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being good and 10 being great, how would you rate the Left Behind series?
As a whole, or do we go book by book?
So
we discovered earlier today that you did not know that there was a Nick Cage remake of Left Behind.
There is a Nick Cage remake of Left Behind.
It's not just Kirk Cameron anymore.
I have something to watch tonight. Okay, so my serious question.
Okay, good, thank you.
Coming off on page 81, you, and this is, I think, how you really draw the conversation of eschatology together, is you say, we should probably remember then that the eschatological teachings in these chapters are not primarily instructions regarding what the Thessalonians should think. The point of this part of the letter is to remind the Thessalonians how they should behave. In other words, eschatology is also about ethics. Yeah. I just wonder if you can elaborate.
Yeah, I think this is why I'm so uncomfortable about eschatology. So many of my formative memories are of I remember being in high school or college and seeing a church on TV that was advertising videotapes that you could order from them for a low cost plus shipping and handling, and give to your neighbors to explain to your neighbors where you went if the rapture happened. Like, this was your way of evangelizing the pagans who were still going to be here once we were all called home. Or we see those bumper stickers, apologies to anybody here who maybe has one of these on their car, that says, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned. And I think there's a you're feeling conviction, aren't you? It's the Spirit moving.
Gonna try to
scrape that off. There's a sense in which when we think about the end and we think about going to our eternal reward, and maybe we're aware, maybe we leave unstated, the flip side of our eternal reward is our enemy's eternal punishment, right? And there's a glibness to some of this thinking, I think, or a sense of satisfaction. Aha, we were right, kinds of things. And 1st and 2nd Thessalonians may be among the most eschatologically oriented letters that Paul wrote, the forward-looking. I'm not saying they are, but they might be among his most future-oriented letters. but they're very much concerned with how do followers of Jesus live now in this world surrounded by people, some of whom know the good news of God's invitation to them, come worship me, come join in the Messianic banquet, come join my people, and some of whom don't. How are we going to live among those people? And the end that we believe is coming, and of course mysteriously, we don't know how it's going to come. Some of us might think we do, but none of us know how it's going to work out. But the end that we believe is coming is not an area for us to debate or argue about or draw up different maps and here are the timelines and see if Russia invades Israel, then we know that we're at this phase of Revelation 16. I'm making all of this up, but that's the point, so is everybody else. We shouldn't be doing that, and instead we should be going, if I really believe Jesus is going to come back to reclaim this earth as his kingdom, how do I live now to prepare a place that's worthy of him and that tells people that Jesus, who I think is coming back, he is, this is going to sound so cheesy me saying this, please don't laugh at me, he is so in love with you. Like, that's why he's coming back. Not because he's angry and he's going to show you, but because he wants you. And our ethics have to live that out.
Yeah, and that's back to the love and the good.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's beautiful. It wasn't cheesy.
It was cheesy, but thank you for not laughing at me.
Let's open it up to questions. Do we have we have a mic. There we go. For people online.
Nothing online yet.
Okay. Yeah, I can walk around with this. Yeah, it'll be easier.
You said you didn't answer all the questions in Thessalonian scholarship in these books, but I'm just curious, what's a live issue among Paul scholars in these letters, and what's the issue, and what's the position you take on it?
So what's the live issue?
Yeah, what's a live issue? I mean, I'm not up on my scholarship on these things, so I'm curious, what are they arguing about, and where do you come down?
Well, we've got a number of different things that we're arguing about. There are a couple of verses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 that seem to express from Paul a really visceral response to non-Christ following Jews who oppress or oppose other Christ-following Jews. And so we're arguing, did Paul actually write these words, or did somebody else sneak them into the text later? Did Paul write 2 Thessalonians? Who is the man of lawlessness? These kinds of things. But I think the most interesting issue is one that isn't even visible to most of us, which is, how does the I don't want to say bland, but very common, non-controversial word, theos, right? Theos, Greek word, just means God. Occurs a bunch of times in, every page of the New Testament. How does the word theos come attached, not with Christian narratives, but with Jewish narratives? So when Paul says things like, and let me not try to do this, the very first verse of 1 Thessalonians, perhaps the very first verse of our New Testament to be written, says, Paul and Silvanus and Timothy, to the assembly of the Thessalonians, in God the Father, there's our theos, in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, grace and peace to you. How do the Jewish narratives of that word God attach to what Paul is saying here? That this is the God of Israel, and he's writing to Greeks, Macedonians, living in a Roman capital that pledge the citizens of whom, the residents of whom, pledge allegiance to a pagan city on the Italian peninsula that's currently dominating Judea, and yet Paul is saying it's not their gods whose grace and peace is coming to you. It's that minority group that is dispossessed, that is under imperial power. Their God rules in the heavens and extends to you grace and peace. And so I think the most urgent conversation that we scholars need to have, and what I'm working on now, is how do we recover the Thessalonian letters as Jewish literature? That's my interest.
What do you expect those who consume this book in particular, whether they're, congregations doing a book study or scholars who are entering a conversation? I'm more interested in the church parish engagement. What do you hope churches can, and pastors who read this, to really be able to wrestle with? What are the one or two things you want them to take away as contributions to the life of the church?
Yeah, thank you. Scott mentioned that a theme running through the book is the theme of hospitality. And as my wife and I are in this new context where we're meeting a lot of people that 6 months ago we didn't know, and people that we wouldn't have rubbed shoulders with a year ago, not like, I wouldn't be seen with it, not like that, but just because we're in a different space. And I'm finding that I'm meeting all kinds of people, some who are proximate to me, more like me, more similar to me, and some who are much, quite distant from me, where I think if you and I sat down and talked about what we actually think, what we actually believe, we would have real differences. But I've been able to watch also that both the proximate and the more distant kinds of people, what they and I have in common is there's so many ways I could go into this. Earlier today in our chapel service, there was a reference in one of the prayers to God Almighty. That sounds like nothing, but I'm like, there's something that we have in common. This recognition that God is Almighty and that they and I come before this God together despite our differences. What I would love for churches that engage this book is to say the things that we argue about, the things that are different between us, they matter. They're not nothing. These are worth fighting about, but they don't matter more than our welcome of one another, because you, like me, are servants and followers of the Lord Jesus Christ and God the Father. So if this book can help facilitate conversations across barriers and boundaries, that would be more than I can really hope for. Thank you.
Other questions? Anything online?
Yeah, we just got one. What do you think is Paul's message of hope for us as the people of God?
In this letter, it's very different than some of Paul's other letters. Again, some of his letters are angry, Galatians. But if I were to sum up the Thessalonian letters, especially 1 Thessalonians, and especially the first 3 chapters, 1 Thessalonians, it's Paul saying, I've been worried about you, and Timothy has come back and told us, you're doing a great job. And so now I'm writing this letter to tell you, one, you're doing a great job, and that I see it. Keep going. I don't know if the church needs to hear this or if it's just me, but I don't use those words to myself very often. I don't look at myself and say, you're doing a great job. I'm very, and maybe some of you can relate to this, I'm very self-critical. I'm very hypercritical. I would never talk to most of you, Ken, but the rest of you, I would never talk to you the way I talk to myself. And yet when I read these letters, the message I get is, no. There's still more to do. There's still ways to go, but you're doing a good job. And I find that really encouraging. So I'm looking at you, Bobby, but whoever wrote that, thank you for that question.
But you are doing a great job.
And you also are doing a great job indeed.
Questions? Yeah, I got it. Oh, here you go.
Okay, so if you were going to choose one passage or chunk or pericope out of these letters to preach on, what would that be and why?
If I was going to preach on one, listen, these are short letters. I could just say 1 Thessalonians, and that would be good. I'm torn. If so, in chapter 2, you have these beautiful metaphors. The most surprising one is where Paul and Silvanus and Timothy call themselves. They say, and so we became. This is in verse 7. Verse 7. Though we could have spoken with gravitas as apostles of Christ, we were instead gentle among you, as a nursing mother who cherishes her own children. This is Paul and Silvanus and Timothy calling themselves a wet nurse, caring for not just her charges, but her own children. And it's a beautiful metaphor. A little later, he says, we became like a father to you, urging, exhorting, comforting, consoling. And we were orphaned from you. So there's a nice cluster of family metaphors that's there. So maybe chapter 2, and if I can, the whole chapter. But if I wasn't sure yet, my other one pericope would then be chapter 3, where Paul seems to be like a little kid on Christmas. He's just so eager. Only it's not an excited eager, like I can't wait to open my presents. Instead, it's I'm scared. I'm worried about them. And he says, and when I could bear it no longer, we sent Timothy to come see you. And then he breaks in, he says we all throughout the letter. We. That sounds like the little pig, doesn't it? We did this. But then he breaks in chapter 3, and he drops the we, and he says, I, Paul, sent for you. He's so nervous for his friends. And when he finds out they're doing well, he's just so relieved. And theologically, it's not the most profound thing. There's nothing in 1 Thessalonians 3 that I'm like, look, this is going to change your life. But when I see Paul not just as a theological text to be understood, but as an example to imitate, there's something about that concern for others that I love. And so I think I might pick one of those two. And if I had a third... yeah.
Thank you. I'm just curious, as I look at Thessalonians chapter 5, I saw about the day of the Lord. And it's kind of interesting to see in terms of, I'm just wondering, what's the difference of the day of the Lord described here in the letter from the day of the Lord that mentioned in the book of Amos?
In the book of Amos. Oh, well, I can't off the top of my head. But of course, I said I don't like eschatology, and then you throw an eschatology question at me here. The day of the Lord is, as I understand it, is one of those symbols that what you think of it depends on where you stand. For those of you who are pursuing your own ends or neglecting the covenant and the commandments of God, who are oppressing others and consuming others for your own advantage, the day of the Lord comes as wrath and vengeance and justice, setting right and putting you in your place. But for those of you who are being oppressed, who are maintaining faithfulness, and yet find themselves wondering, where is the one who is a champion for me? Where is the one who protects me? Where is the one who defends me? The day of the Lord is God showing up and saying, I'm right here, that your cries will not go unheard and unheeded, and that bringing in of justice and renewal and whatnot. And so that's why eschatology and ethics are so closely linked, because how you live now will affect how you experience that day. And so the eschatological image of Jesus descending, returning to earth in chapter 4 leads right into that chapter 5 stuff where Paul is saying, and so we are not of the darkness, we are not of the night, we are of the day, we are of the light. Those who get drunk at night. Those who sleep during the night, but we are awake, we are sober-minded, and we are doing the good. Because we know how the story ends, we can have some clarity about how we should live now. I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but does that help? Yeah, thanks, Bala.
I think we have one more online, and then we can go next.
Sure, another one online. In your opinion, what differentiates 1st and 2nd Thessalonians from Paul's other writings? It seems to me that Paul's letters are all pastoral in their approach. Do you agree or disagree?
No, I would agree. I would agree. There's a lot of heavy thinking and doctrine and theology in these texts, but all of them are written to address particular occasions. I keep looking at you, Bobby, as if you're asking me this question. I apologize.
I am all of the people.
Yeah, I am all the people. All of the letters are occasional and written to address the particular needs and questions and concerns of a moment, and so they are all very pastoral. And I think that's one of the things that makes reading letters like 1st and 2nd Thessalonians so difficult today, because they're not written for our questions and our concerns. But it's also what makes it such a wonderful opportunity to read them today, because these letters give us permission to address our own questions from a mindset or a way of thinking that tries to approximate how Paul thought about his world, if that makes sense. Yeah. Sarah?
Thanks. Thank you. I'm going to tell you up front, I'm not asking you personally to solve this. Okay, what do we see in Paul? What have you seen in study of these letters that reflection on this that can help us today reflect on this question about transgressing those boundaries? So interesting. I think on the one hand, then, there's a way in which the church's identity, composition, and practice is inherently dynamic, right? Who we are is constantly changing. How we do things, constantly changing. Also, it's the same God who at any place in that transgression, positive transgression, right? People are being drawn toward this same God, right? So I think throughout time, and we're in touch today with the church, feels that challenge and wrestles with how do we change and remain faithful at the same time? Are there takeaways that you've seen in these letters that can help us reflect on that?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And it comes back to a conversation Scott and I were having earlier today about boundaries and about how I do think in my own thinking, I keep wanting to, so how do we do life without boundaries and being overwhelmed by the impossibility of that? And Scott was actually making a helpful point. I don't mean to sound surprised there, sorry. Scott was making a helpful point.
Even a blind squirrel finds an acorn every once in a while.
He was making the helpful point that there are always going to be, we always are laying the boundaries. So the question is, how and where do we lay the boundaries? And then, and here's the answer to your question thing, is that, and then once the boundary is laid, you start asking the question, well, why here? Who am I excluding? Why do I need to move it? And so, as you said, it's always dynamic. It's always shifting. And it's not because God is always changing, not the church is changing, but because boundaries are so important, and yet they are also so problematic. And where the church, I think, gets stuck and begins to lose sight of its calling is when we lay the boundaries and go, no, we put so much time and energy and effort into making sure that these boundaries are in the right place, that we're pretty confident in these and they will not be moved. Well, now we've lost the plot.
Yeah. I'm thinking 'cause we live in a concrete world, right? And so I've lost it, right? But you can't have an abstract thing. It has to be embodied.
That's right.
Right, and the bodies are always changing.
That's right.
The shape is always
That's
changing.
right. I think that's a good way of putting it. Thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. So I think in the 30 seconds we have left, you reference at one point a gentleman with doctoral certifications who quotes from Frozen 2 far too often. How autobiographical is this confession?
It's not.
That's disappointing.
It's not autobiographical. If I were going to quote one of the Frozen movies, it would certainly be Frozen 1, Let It Go. But it's true. I did have a colleague who, with doctoral qualifications, said he finds himself quoting Elsa from Frozen 2. Do the next right thing. Do the next right thing. Do the next right thing. So I wrote that and sent that to him, and that was funny. But yeah, appreciate that.
Let's thank Dr. Rodríguez.
So do you have any parting shots at all, Scott?
No, thank you. It's a great book.
Yes, it is.
I highly recommend.
Yes.
Pick it up.
Thanks
Thank
for the
you.
rich conversation. Thanks to all of you here in this room for attending, and those of you online. For those of you here, there are still some treats left and some to-go boxes. And I guess I know what Nick Cage movie I'm going to watch on Netflix tonight.
There you
I'll
go.
probably follow that up with a Frank Peretti book.
Oh, there you go.
All right, everyone. Thank you, and have a good night.
Thank you.